Hey, Kaden. I know that you didn't get to listen to the rest of George's Marvelous Medicine. I think it was just a day that you came in late, which is a little deal, not a big deal. And so I wanted to make sure that I read to you the rest of the story. So I was going to start reading to you if that's okay. So we had just made medicine number 4, and it had made things very, very small, remember? So now we are in our last couple of chapters, and this chapter is entitled Goodbye, Grandma. There's still something you left out, Mr. Cranky said. I can't think of what it could be, George said. Give it up, Mrs. Cranky said. Pack it in. You'll never get it right. Mr. Cranky looked very upset. George looked pretty upset, too. He was still kneeling on the ground with a spoon in one hand and a cup full of brown medicine in the other. The ridiculous tiny hen was slowly walking away. At that point, Grandma came striding into the yard from her enormous height. She glared down at the 3 people below her and shouted, What's going on here? Why hasn't anybody brought me my morning cup of tea? It's bad enough having to sleep in the yard with the rats and the mice, but I'll be blowed if someone's going to starve me as well. No tea, no eggs and bacon, no buttery toast? I'm sorry, Mother, Mrs. Cranky said. We've been terribly busy. I'll get something to you right away. Hell, let George get it, that lazy little brute, Grandma shouted. Just then the old woman spotted the cup in George's hand. She bent down, peered into it. She saw it was full of a brown liquid. It looked very much like tea. Ho, 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 she cried. Ha, ha, so that's your game, is it? You look after yourself all right, don't you? You make quite sure that you've got a nice cup of morning tea, but you didn't think to bring one over to your poor old grandma? I always knew you were selfish. No, Grandma, George said. That isn't. Don't you lie to me, boy, the enormous old woman shouted. Pass it up here this minute. No, cried Mrs. Cranky. No, Mother, don't. That's not for you. Oh, now you're against me too, shouted Grandma. My own daughter trying to stop me from having breakfast, trying to starve me out. Mr. Cranky looked up at the horrid old woman and smiled sweetly. Of course it's for you, Grandma, he said. You take it and drink it while it's nice and hot. Don't think I won't, Grandma said, bending down from her great height and reaching out a huge hand for the cup. Hand it over, George. No, Grandma, no. George pulled away, pulling the cup with him. You mustn't have it. Now give it to me right now, boy. Don't, cried Mrs. Cranky. That's George's marvelous. Everything's George around here, Grandma said. George this, George that. I'm fed up with it. She snatched the cup out of little George's hand and held it up high out of reach. Drink it up, Grandma, Mr. Cranky said, grinning. Lovely tea. The other 2 cried, No. But it was too late. The ancient beanpole had already put the cup up to her lips, and in one gulp she swallowed everything that was in it. Mother! Wailed Mrs. Cranky. You've just drunk 50 doses of George's Marvelous Medicine number 4, and look what one tiny spoonful did to that little brown head. But Grandma didn't even hear her. Great clouds of steam were already pouring out of her mouth, and she was beginning to whistle. This is gonna be interesting, Mr. Cranky said, still grinning. Now you've done it, Mrs. Cranky said, glaring at her husband. You cooked the old girl's goose. I didn't do anything, Mr. Cranky said. Oh, yes, you did. You told her to drink it. Then a tremendous hissing sound was coming from above their heads. Steam was shooting out of Grandma's mouth and nose and ears and whistling as it came. She'll feel better after she lets out a bit of steam, Mr. Cranky said. She's gonna blow up, Mrs. Cranky wailed. Her boiler's going to burst. Stand clear, Mr. Cranky said. George was quite alarmed. He stood up and ran back a few paces. Jets of white steam kept squirting out of the skinny old woman's head, and the whistling was so high and shrill it hurt your ears. Call the fire department, cried Mrs. Cranky. Call the police, man the hoses. It's too late, Mr. Cranky said, looking pleased. Grandma! cried Mrs. Cranky. Mother, run into the drinking trough and put your head under the water." But even as she spoke, the whistling suddenly stopped and the steam disappeared. Then Grandma began to get smaller. And she had started off with her head as high as the roof of the house, but now she was coming down, and she was coming down fast. "Hey, watch this, George," Mr. Cranky shouted, hopping around the yard, flapping his arms. "Watch what happens when someone's had 50 doses, 50 spoonfuls instead of one." Very soon, Grandma was back to normal height. "Oh, stop!" Mrs. Cranky said. "That's just right." But she didn't stop. Smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller she got. Down, down, down she went. In another half-minute, she was no bigger than a bottle of lemonade. "How do you feel, Mother?" asked Mrs. Cranky anxiously. Grandma's tiny face bore the same foul and furious expression it always had on it. Her eyes, now no bigger than keyholes, were blazing with anger. "How do I feel?" she yelled. "How do you think I feel? How would you feel if you were a glorious giant a minute ago and now suddenly you're a little person?" "She's still going," Mr. Cranky said gleefully. "She's still getting smaller." And by golly, she was. When she was no bigger than a match, Mrs. Cranky made a grab for her. She held her in her hands and cried, "How do I stop her from getting smaller still?" "You can't," said Mr. Cranky. "She's had 50 times the right amount." "I must stop her," Mrs. Cranky wailed. "I can hardly see her as it is." "Catch a hold of each end and pull," Mr. Cranky said. By then, Grandma was the size of a penny and still shrinking fast. A moment later, she was no bigger than a pin, then a pumpkin seed, then... Do you see her? Here she is. Then she's here. And now she's a speck. Now she's totally gone. "Where is she?" cried Mrs. Cranky. "I've lost her." "Hooray!" said Mr. Cranky. "She's gone? She's disappeared completely," cried Mrs. Cranky. "That's what happens when you're grumpy and bad-tempered," said Mr. Cranky. "Great medicine of yours, George." George didn't know what to think. For a few minutes, Mrs. Cranky kept wandering around with a puzzled look on her face, saying, "Mother, where are you? Where have you gone? Where have you gone to? How can I find you?" But she calmed down quite quickly, and by lunchtime she was saying, "Well, I suppose it's all for the best, really. She was a bit of a nuisance around the house, wasn't she?" "Yeah. Yes," Mr. Cranky said. "She most certainly was." But George didn't say a word. He felt quite terribly. He knew something tremendous had taken place that morning. For a few brief moments he had touched with the very tips of his fingers the edge of a magic world. The end. Yay! Good job, Kaden. I hope you liked the ending of this book.